Our reading today is from Revelation 2, 8 through 11. To the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, "These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death." The word of the Lord.
Well, happy scriptures. It's going to be an exciting morning. You know, Ben mentioned these cards. What he forgot to tell you was on the back, if you put them all together, they form a puzzle. It'll be top secret. If you don't want to know what it is, don't look at the slide behind me. But the other thing is, if you missed the card last week and you're one of those people who needs the puzzle piece, I also want to direct you to my eBay page. I've got a couple. No, I'm kidding. We'll give it to you. But listen, they do have prayers on them, something that you can really connect with God during this Lenten season. And each week it's different. So really, I encourage you to use these, to put them in a place where you'll see them, to take that moment to refocus on God. Because during this time of Lent, during this time of preparation, as we look forward to the resurrection, it's good to connect with God. So my first job out of college was working for a company called Shaw Industries. I was hired right out of college and sent down to Dalton, Georgia for what normally would be like a 3-month training period, and it turned out to be about 7 months because the territory that we were waiting for hadn't opened up yet. And so I spent a lot of time down there, kind of had some roots down there and made friends. I made friends with this guy. His name was Elbert Shaw. The best way to describe Elbert is if you think of Mr. Rogers and Howdy Doody combined, that's what Elbert was like. He was like this guy who just loved everybody, and he would tell you that. He'd be like, "I love you, and you're the best." And Elbert went faithfully to this youth detention center. In fact, you can see, I didn't even realize this till I was like, I wonder if there's a picture of Elbert that I could show. They named the youth detention center after him. Like, it's the Elbert Shaw, that's what this kid is wearing. Like, this is the Elbert Shaw Regional Youth Detention Center. And when I was down there for the 7 months, Elbert knew I was a Christian. He's like, "Hey, do you want to come tell these kids about Jesus with me?" And so we would go, and we had fun. And we'd always go out for barbecue afterwards and eat good Georgia barbecue. And while we were eating one day, he's like, "Hey, Scott, I've always wanted to see fall in New England." And I was like, "Oh, that's great, yeah." I mean, I knew my territory was going to be New York City. I was going to be living in Connecticut. I was like, "Next fall, just come up and we'll do that." But it was like this year. It was one of those falls where it was warmer than normal. So when he came up, instead of seeing like yellows and oranges and reds, it was like green and green and green and the same greens he had in Georgia. But fortunately, I had some friends up in Vermont. I'm like, "Hey, let's just head north. We'll see color." And as we were driving up, I just remember we were driving along and looking, and I'd be like, "Whoa, look at that tree, and yeah, that one's amazing, and check that out." And he was just kind of like, "Yep, uh-huh." And I was like, "No, this is great." And I looked, and I didn't realize what was going on until I had to rub my nose, and I took my sunglasses off, and I was like, "Oh yeah, everything's just kind of average." But I had these really good lenses on my sunglasses. It was making all the colors pop, and so I was like, "Oh yeah, that's a big difference." So I was like, "Hey, Albert, here, try these on." So here he is, like with these oval bug green glasses, this old guy, and he's like, "Whoa." And so, we were seeing the same trees, but we had a completely different vision for it. And so I just let him wear my glasses for the rest of the time. He had a great experience, and we had a lot of fun like that. I remember him writing them down. He's like, what kind of glasses are these? I'd like to get myself a pair. There you go. And so we're in week 2 of our series of letters to the churches, and we're focusing on the 7 letters in Revelation. And these letters are really unique in the Bible. Like, most of the New Testament is letters. We have letters of Paul and John and Peter, but these are the letters of Jesus. And as we look at these letters, I really believe that Jesus wants to change our vision. He really wants us to begin to see the world the way he sees the world. And it's really different from the way we naturally want to look at things. But when we learn to see his eyes, we'll have a whole new perspective, and really, his perspective is what matters. And even though these letters are written to 7 specific churches, they also act as a mirror that reflects the strengths and weaknesses of all churches throughout history. And the church, capital C, which is really the people, all of us. And so this little letter is only 4 verses long. We're reading this, it's to the Church of Smyrna, which is kind of a strange name, but that was the name of it. And the good news is Jesus has no criticism for this church, right? A lot of these lampstands here, Jesus is like, you're pretty good here, you're not really good here. Some he's like, you're just bad. But Smyrna, he's like, you guys are great. But he has some difficult words for them to hear. I don't know if you were here last week, but heard the introduction. These 7 churches were in Asia, and they formed a ring. You can see here, the red circle is where Smyrna is. Just below it is Ephesus, which we talked about last week. And as we work our way around the ring, you'll hear about these different cities. But Smyrna was called the crown of Asia. In fact, stamped on their coins, if you had a coin from Smyrna, it would say this. It would say, first city of Asia in size and beauty. I mean, they really can you imagine that? Like, here you go, we're the best. We're awesome. We put it right on our coins. And it was a center of commerce. They had a great port. It was a very prosperous city. They even had the right wind. Like in the heat of summer, and it apparently gets pretty hot in this area of Turkey, the wind would come in, this zephyr wind would just blow and act like an air conditioner for the city. So not only did they have a good port, a good location, lots of commerce, they even had like a built-in cooling system. And they had culture. A lot of great writers were born here. Homer, being the most notable, was born right here in Smyrna. And this city still exists. It's the 3rd largest in Turkey. It's called Izmir today. And the ruins are still being uncovered of this former civilization. They had a huge amphitheater. You can see this is some of the arches of the Agora, which was the central meeting area. And they're still finding things out there of the glory of this city. And what you really need to know about Smyrna is that it was extremely patriotic to the Roman Empire. I mean, like, really patriotic. It was the first city that had a temple to the goddess Roma. Like, before there was even emperor worship, they were worshiping the goddess of Roma. And right here in the town, they had a temple. And then when emperor worship became a thing, 7 cities were competing, not just these 7 cities, but 7 of the major cities in Asia were like, we want to be the ones who builds the temple to the Roman emperor. And it was awarded to Smyrna. And they built, in 26 AD, they built this temple to the emperor who then was Tiberius. And so you can imagine, with that much patriotism, with that much worship of Rome, not to participate in that would have been considered treasonous. And that's why Smyrna was suffering. This little church in Smyrna was suffering. And we don't know really many details about this church. We assume that it was started by believers in Ephesus who just kind of migrated north and were like, hey, we have good news. We want to tell you all about Jesus. There's tradition that maybe Paul stayed there one night because apparently Timothy's brother lived in Smyrna. Who knew? But even in this thriving city where the citizens were doing well, the Christians were poor and persecuted. And it's to this suffering little flock that Jesus is speaking. And when you think about it, the fact that this church was growing at all is amazing. I mean, think about what they were up against. Think about inviting your neighbor. Hey, guy, listen, I go to this church. It's called Trinity. It's amazing. You should come. If you get really involved, you're probably going to lose everything you have. You may get to go to jail. And who knows? You may even die. Oh, and don't forget to bring your kids, right? I mean, that's a pretty hard sales pitch to bring along. But yet, this church was growing, and even under this intense fire of persecution. And so just to step back a little bit and give you just a larger picture of what was happening, I mentioned this idea of emperor worship. And Christian persecution is intensifying during this time. And all Roman citizens are supposed to worship the emperor as God. And last week it was mentioned in Revelation 1, 10 and 11 that John gets this vision. He's already on the Isle of Patmos. He's already basically in jail for not worshiping the emperor. And it starts out with this phrase, on the Lord's Day, which is a really interesting phrase because it's the only time, apparently, that this exact phraseology is used. This is not just talking about Sunday or the Sabbath. This is talking about a specific day. And the likelihood is it was the one day a year where all of the citizens were required to go, and what they would do is they would take a pinch of incense, and they would drop it on the fire and say 3 little words, Caesar is Lord. Just 3 little words. That doesn't seem so difficult. But the consequences for not doing it were dramatic. And I gotta think, you must have been thinking hey, God, how about just between you and me? Look, I'm gonna say that, but I'm gonna cross my fingers and be like, yeah, I know I said Caesar is Lord, but you and me, we know that you're Lord. But this church stood under that persecution. And the reason is because they found something that was more valuable than just the stuff that we can see and touch here. And that only makes sense if you can see the world through Jesus' eyes, if you can see how he sees. Because Jesus' kingdom is very different. It's different from the kingdom of this world. In fact, Jesus, in describing it, when he was walking on the earth, people were like, hey, what's the kingdom of God like? He's like, oh, let me tell you. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. And when he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had, and he bought that one pearl. That's what the kingdom of God is like. And the church in Smyrna found their great pearl, the one thing they valued more than anything else. And it was Jesus. And we're all looking for something. We're all looking for that peace. There's an old joke, I don't know if you ever heard it, but it says, what happens when you play a country song backwards? And the answer is you get your wife back, your trailer back, your dog back, and your pickup truck starts working again. And it's human nature to look for that one thing, what's going to turn the record of my life in the other direction so things start working out? What's that missing piece? And we as humans spend so much time in pursuit of that. What's going to fill this thing here? And we try stuff and we try status. And it's one of those unreachable things, right? It's like, I know it's just around this corner. And if I could get around this corner, but it's like when you get there, you're like, ooh, maybe it's the next corner, or maybe it's the next corner. I know J.D. Rockefeller, when he was at the time the richest man in the whole world, somebody said, well, how much money is enough? And he's like, oh, just a little more. Just a little more. It's never enough. But the church in Smyrna was just the opposite. They had nothing. But in God's eyes, they had everything. And it's to this group that Jesus writes a letter. I can just picture him. He's like, okay, take this down, John, right? Because we know John actually wrote it down, but it's Jesus speaking to John. And he says this, to the angel in the Church of Smyrna write, these are the words of him who's the first and the last, who died and came to life again. And this is the comfort needed specifically for what this little church needed. Now, Jesus introduces himself two ways in this letter, and it's different in every letter. If you read them, and you'll hear them, there's always an introduction, but it's always different. And he says, listen, guys, you need to know that I'm the first and the last. And he's basically saying, when he says that, he's saying, I'm not just a guy, I'm God. Because he's quoting from the book of Isaiah, and it says it several times, but one instance is here in Isaiah 44, where he says, I'm the first and I'm the last. Apart from me, there is no God. He's saying, I started it all, and I will end it all. Get a bigger view of me. Your lives aren't bounded by the actions of Caesar or the Roman Empire. Empires, they rise and they fall. And Jesus will have the first word and the last word. And 1 John tells us he's also the word of life right in the middle, bringing us life as we walk through those things. He also said, I died and came to life, which is a really important thing because later he's going to say, some of you guys may give up your very lives, but you need to know this. That's not the worst thing that could happen. I've died. I rose again. See, the real danger is the second death, which is separation from God forever. And Jesus wants the churches to know that he knows them specifically. And again, in each letter, he has these little I know statements. And here he's going to have two for this church. He's going to say, listen, guys, I see you. And imagine what it was like for that little church, right? Here they are, they're suffering, they're probably in hiding, they're not saying much, and all of a sudden, one guy comes in, he's like, guess what? The Apostle John wrote a letter from Jesus. It's a prophetic word. This is it. And then they're flipping through. Our name is in here? Like, this is to us. That would be an amazing moment. And Jesus wants them to know that he knows what they're going through. And I know that phrase means two things, right? It means like, I see what you're going through, but it also, in this case, can mean like, I know what you're going through. I've walked there. He says, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they're Jews but are not and are a synagogue of Satan. I mean, Jesus understood poverty. He had basically the clothes that he wore, not even a place to live, really. And on the cross, even that was stripped from him and gambled for. In Smyrna, all commerce was controlled by trade guilds. And if you wanted to buy or sell, you had to be part of one of these guilds. But if you were a follower of Christ, you were excluded from these guilds, which is probably why this little church was so poor. We don't know if they started out poor, but we know they were poor at the time of this writing. And it's probably because they couldn't buy, they couldn't sell, they would lose their businesses. And yet, Jesus says, I know you're poor, but you're rich in what matters. I looked it up just because I was curious. You know, I looked up Forbes, like, how many billionaires died last year in 2022? And according to Forbes, 26 billionaires died. And you know how much they left behind? Everything. It didn't matter what they had here. It matters what happens 1 minute after we step into eternity. And the Bible uses all kinds of transient imagery to describe our earthly lives. We're like vapor, we're like the grass and the things of the field, and our lives are just a moment. In fact, we kicked off Lent with Ash Wednesday, and as we were receiving the imposition of ashes, we were reminded that from dust that we are dust, and to dust we will return. See, it's eternity is what matters. When we see things like Jesus, he's the beginning and the end. He knows what really matters. And Jesus understood slander. Slander is a tough one because, when people start speaking against us, he was falsely accused and put to death by the ones who should have been closest to him, who should have embraced him the most. And still, he taught us, blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. And these Christians were being persecuted not just by the Romans, but also by the Jews in this town. And I just want to say something, because this synagogue of Satan is really, that's pretty harsh language, and it's been used by some to be very anti-Semitic, and that would be a really terrible and wrong interpretation of this. What was happening here is we had Jews who were beginning to pick and choose. Like, I kind of like this from Rome, I kind of like this from Judaism, and they were creating like this pseudo-Jewish religion. And they had joined forces with the Romans to persecute the Christians. And Jesus is saying, these Jews aren't serving the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob anymore. They're serving Satan's plans and not God's plans, hence synagogue of Satan. And I just want to focus for a second on the word affliction, because that's not a word you hear too often, right? Hey, Bob, I noticed your afflictions lately, right? We don't just like casually throw that around in a business situation. But the Greek word here was a special word. It's a word thlipsis, which is not easy to say. It takes a little practice. But it means pressure. But more specifically, it means crushing pressure. This is never used in the Bible to mean the normal, like day in, day out pressure. It's like, I have pressure to be here on time, pressure to pick up the kids. That's not what they're talking about here. One commentator I read said, you should think of it this way. It's like being crushed to death under a giant boulder, which is pretty dramatic. Thlipsis is literally the battle line where the kingdom of life meets the kingdom of darkness. And Jesus also, the kingdom of death. And Jesus also understood this pressure as he sweat drops of blood in Gethsemane, right? Praying, God, I know what's coming, but if there's any way, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, your will be done. And as I read this, that's what I want Jesus to say to this little church in Smyrna, right? Don't worry, guys. I know it's been hard, but I'm going to take this cup for you. But that's not what he says. Instead, he warns them, guys, it's going to become more difficult. In fact, he says it this way in verse 10, don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. And all through this letter, Jesus is weaving in the theme, there's greater reality than what you're experiencing here. He says, look, I know you're poor here, but in everything that matters, you guys are rich. And I know some of you will taste death here on earth, but don't worry, because it will lead to life everlasting with me. And I know society looks at you like you're failures, but guess what? I have a crown of victory that you're going to wear. I know what you're experiencing, but I know the end as well. And most of us here, we don't really know suffering like that. We don't know the crushing pressure, the thlipsis of a society, of a government, because it was, there were a lot of things conspiring against these Christians. But people all over the world are suffering for the gospel. They're suffering for Christ. I remember I read a book by a guy named Richard Wurmbrand, and if you don't know him, he was a Romanian pastor, And when, after the Second World War, when the communist occupation came in, he and his family made a stand for Christ, and it ended up, he was thrown in prison and horribly persecuted. And out of that, if you've ever heard of Voice of the Martyrs, it's an organization that was started by Richard and his wife to just, well, I'm just going to read it to you. They're dedicated to supporting, hold on, not that one yet. They're dedicated to supporting persecuted church and inspiring believers to deepen their commitment to Christ and to fill his great commission no matter what the cost. And I remember as I was reading this story, and this goes back probably 35 years ago, I read this. And what I won't forget is that as I remember being shocked by what he had to suffer in prison. But I also remember the way he described the presence of God, just the reality and the nearness of Jesus. And it was so tangible. There was something in me that was like, that is what I want. And I had this crazy thought inside of me. I was like, to have this nearness to Jesus, it would almost be worth going through that. And I was like a little scared by that, but I won't forget that because ultimately, this is what we want. Not just like a faith that's like, yeah, I could take it, I could leave it, but one where it's like God is so here. I love this quote by Vern Brand, who said, "There once was a fiddler who played so beautifully that everybody danced. A deaf man who could not hear the music considered them all insane. Those who are with Jesus in suffering hear this music to which other men are deaf. They dance and do not care if they're considered insane." The only way to dance in suffering is if you can see it how Jesus sees. Think of Stephen, who was being stoned, and he looks up and says, "I see heaven opened up." And remember, the Christians in Smyrna weren't suffering because they did the wrong thing. They were suffering because they did the right thing. In fact, Jesus has no criticism for this church. They're being persecuted for shining the light of Jesus. That's why this lampstand imagery is used. But as they were shining the light, the darkness was fighting back. And the persecution wasn't just coming from one source. It was the sum of the wrath of a threatened political system, a hostile religious system, and spiritual forces of evil manipulating them both. In fact, that's why Jesus reminded the Smyrnans that the devil will put some of them in jail. And even though it will get tougher, the time is fixed. That's what that 10-day period means. There's a lot of different thoughts about what that exactly meant. But you can look at it as it was a short time, a fixed time. And Jesus is in control because he's the beginning and the end. And there's an incredible power that comes from holding on to the gospel above everything else. I remember learning that in a very small way. I had knee surgery. I used to tell people I crashed my hang glider, and that's how I blew my knee. But the truth is I was walking downstairs, and I slipped and fell. But it was much cooler to say hang glider. but I was like, oh, man. And I knew I was going to have surgery, but I was like, but God, you could heal me. Why not? And if you do, I'll tell everybody about this amazing God who heals. And let's do a miracle on the old knee, God. That'd be amazing. And that didn't really happen. And so I was in for surgery. I was backpedaled a little. I was like, okay. Well, God, let recovery go faster than they imagine. And then I'll give glory to your name. I'll be like, yay, God's so good. I recovered so much faster. And I ended up getting a blood clot in my calf right below my knee. And then I had to be in the hospital, and I wasn't allowed to move, and I couldn't do anything. And my only movement, I had a therapist come in and move my patella like this, just so it wouldn't lock up. That was all the exercise I was allowed to do. And if you know anything about knee surgery, you really want to move your knee afterwards. So things were just tanking. And then I remember my knee swelled up huge. And my doctor came in and he's like, Scott, this isn't going to be fun, but we're going to have to try to drain this thing, and I'm going to spare you all the gory details, but I need to tell you that he pulled out a syringe that I can only describe. If you were going to get like a psycho doctor Halloween costume, this is the syringe that would come in that costume. It was huge. I didn't even know they made them this big, and he's like, all right, here we go. And I remember him like grabbing the plunger like this, and literally he put his foot on it, like trying to get something out, and nothing was happening. And he's like, yep, that's beyond me. And whatever he did sparked something in my leg, and I started getting just these racking convulsions. I just can't even, it was really painful. And I remember being alone at night in my hospital room, and I was in lots of pain. And I was like, God, come on. I wanted to give you glory for your name. And it went from pretty bad to really bad to, this is really bad. What the heck is going on? And I felt lonely, and I felt abandoned. I felt like God had forgotten about me. And in that moment, God chose to speak to me. Not audibly, but I knew I was communicating with God. And he said, Scott, am I still good? Am I still good? And you know, I said, yeah, you're still good. And all of a sudden, something just opened up inside of me, and I just started worshiping him. All alone, and my pain didn't change, and my circumstances didn't change, but I changed because I realized that even though it didn't work out the way I wanted it to, God was still good. And I would never want that small suffering to be compared with what Christians suffer day in, day out all over the world. Wurmbrand, who truly suffered, understood that even in the darkest of dark places, God can meet us. And even in those places, he can crown us with life. And he said this, he said, I found truly jubilant Christians only in the Bible, in the underground church, and in prison. Now that's an unbelievable thing to say, because what it should say is, I found truly jubilant Christians who can worship freely and do whatever they want. But he's saying, no, even in the midst of these places, God is. And so let's just look at the final verse. Verse 11, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. And this little letter was written to comfort a suffering church. Jesus knew what they were going to endure, and he wanted to make sure they understood that life would be waiting for them at the end. No matter what happened on earth, they would never be separated from him, right? That's the second death, separation from God forever. But being a Christian, it doesn't make us immune from trouble. In fact, Jesus told us, guys, you're gonna have trouble. In this world, you'll have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. There is a greater truth than the lies that the world offers. And with Jesus, we can see things with his perspective. And ultimately, we'll receive the victor's crown. And none of us really want this pressure, this thlipsis in our lives. And I can imagine if this is your first time with us in church, welcome, we're glad to have you. And it's not always like this, I promise. But this is an important message that we need to hear. All of us. Hear the heart of your Savior. He's saying, just put on my glasses, see the way I see, hear the song of the fiddler, hold the pearl of great price. Because I'm the first and I'm the last, the one who died and the one who rose again. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to just respond to this God. We're going to respond in a time of worship. And I don't know where you are in your walk with God, but all of us can take a step closer. I think there's an opportunity for us to step closer to God, to just say, you know what, God, I know I'm rooted and grounded in what I can see, taste, touch, all my senses here, but I also am aware that there's a bigger reality, and I want you to show me how to plug into that reality. And so I'm going to turn it over to the band, and Anna has a really great song queued up. And as you think about the new wine of the Spirit, God doing something new, I just pray that you'd worship him with all you have.